23 people, one Christmas morning. A decision that would echo through Georgia for generations. What happened on that plantation wasn't just shocking, it was something that challenged everything the authorities thought they understood about loyalty, desperation, and the lengths human beings will go to when pushed beyond their breaking point. This is the story of what those 23 souls did and why the truth took decades to fully emerge. Before we continue with the story of Riverside Plantation and the events that shook Georgia to its core, if you're fascinated by dark historical mysteries that blur the line between fact and legend, subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell. You won't want to miss what comes next. Now, let's step back to 1847, to a place where silence held more secrets than words ever could. The Oconee River carved through middle Georgia like a silver scar, and along its eastern bank sat Riverside Plantation, 3,000 acres of cotton fields, timber stands, and red clay soil that turned to rust-cold mud every winter. The main house rose 3 stories high, white columns gleaming in the sun, a monument to prosperity built on the backs of those who would never walk through its front door. By December of 1847, Riverside had been in the Hartwell family for 42 years. James Hartwell III ran the operation with the same iron discipline his father and grandfather had employed, though neighbors whispered he'd taken that discipline to places even his ancestors wouldn't have ventured. The plantation housed 23 enslaved people, a relatively small number compared to the massive operations closer to Savannah, but Hartwell preferred it that way. Easier to control, he'd say, easier to watch. The enslaved community at Riverside lived in a row of cabins behind the main house. Crude structures with gaps in the walls that let in winter wind and summer heat alike. Each cabin measured roughly 12 feet by 14 feet, housing anywhere from 3 to 6 people depending on family size. The floors were packed dirt that turned to mud when rain leaked through the poorly maintained roofs. A single fireplace in each cabin provided heat and cooking space, but wood was rationed. And during the coldest months, people huddled together under threadbare blankets, their breath visible in the frigid air. There was Samuel, the oldest at 56, who'd been born on the property and remembered James Hartwell II. His hands were gnarled from decades of cotton picking, his back permanently bent from years of stooping in the fields, but his mind remained sharp, and younger workers often sought his counsel on matters both practical and spiritual. Samuel had seen 3 generations of Hartwells, had watched the plantation grow from a modest operation to one of the more prosperous in the county, and he understood the family's patterns and vulnerabilities better than they understood themselves. Ruth worked in the main house, one of 3 people allowed inside the white columns and polished floors. She was 38 years old, light-skinned enough that rumors circulated about her parentage. Rumors that were probably true given James Hartwell II's well-known proclivities. Ruth saw things the field workers never did. The family arguments, the financial ledgers left open on desks, the letters from creditors that arrived with increasing frequency. She heard conversations through doorways, learned secrets that could be valuable if one knew how to use them. Her position gave her access, but it also isolated her from the cabin community, making her suspect to both the white family and her fellow enslaved workers. Thomas was barely 19, tall and strong, with eyes that held a simmering anger he'd learned to hide behind a mask of compliance. His mother, Dinah, had been sold 3 years earlier to settle a gambling debt of James Hartwell's. Thomas had watched her being loaded onto a wagon, had heard her screams as she was driven away, and something inside him had broken that day. He'd become quieter, more withdrawn. But those who knew him well could see the rage building beneath the surface like water behind a dam. There was also Esther, 42 years old, who served as the community's unofficial healer and midwife. She knew plants and roots, could ease pain and bring down fevers, had delivered most of the children born on the plantation in the last 20 years. Her knowledge made her valuable, but it also made Hartwell nervous. He didn't like things he couldn't understand or control, and Esther's abilities fell into both categories. Benjamin and Clara were a married couple in their early 30s, parents to 3 children ranging from 4 to 11 years old. Benjamin worked as a carpenter, skilled enough that Hartwell sometimes hired him out to neighboring plantations, keeping the wages for himself. Clara worked in the fields during planting and harvest seasons in the main house kitchen during slower periods. They'd managed to maintain their family unit intact, a rare blessing in a system that routinely separated parents from children, husbands from wives. There was Moses, a quiet man of 40 who'd been purchased from a plantation in South Carolina 5 years earlier. He'd arrived with scars on his back that told a story he never spoke about, and a weariness in his eyes that suggested he'd seen the worst of what the system could do. He kept to himself mostly, but he was strong and reliable, and the other workers had gradually accepted him into their community. Young Lily was 16, pretty in a way that made her vulnerable to unwanted attention. Her mother, Sarah, watched her constantly, trying to keep her safe from dangers that were all too real. Sarah herself was 34, worn down by years of fieldwork and the constant anxiety of raising a daughter in a place where young women had no protection from the desires of white men. There was also Jacob, the blacksmith, whose skills made him indispensable. He was 50 years old, powerfully built despite his age, with hands that could shape iron, and a mind that understood mechanics and engineering. The plantation's tools, the iron fittings on wagons and buildings, the horseshoes and hinges, and countless other metal necessities all came from Jacob's forge. Hartwell knew Jacob's value, which gave the blacksmith slightly more leverage than most, though that leverage was limited and dangerous to use. The other members of the community included patients Hannah, Daniel, Elijah, Rebecca, Nathan, Grace, Joseph, Martha, Abigail, and Caleb. Each with their own stories, their own wounds, their own reasons for what would happen that Christmas morning. They ranged in age from 14 to 56, in skills from field hands to craftspeople. But they shared a common experience of life under James Hartwell's rule, and that shared experience would ultimately bind them together in an act that none of them could have undertaken alone. James Hartwell III was 41 years old in the winter of 1847, a man of medium height with dark hair beginning to gray at the temples and pale blue eyes that seemed to look through people rather than at them. He'd inherited Riverside at age 23 when his father died of a stroke, and he'd run it with an efficiency that impressed his fellow planters, even as it troubled some of them. Hartwell believed in discipline above all else, rigid schedules, harsh punishments for infractions, constant surveillance to prevent what he called idleness and insubordination. His wife Margaret was 36, a woman from a prominent Savannah family who'd married Hartwell when she was 18. She'd borne him 4 children, though 2 had died in infancy, leaving a son of 12 and a daughter of 9. Margaret was not a cruel woman by nature, but she'd been raised in a system that taught her to see enslaved people as property rather than human beings, and she'd never seriously questioned that teaching. She ran the household with quiet efficiency, managing the domestic workers and maintaining the social obligations expected of a plantation mistress. The overseer, a man named Dutch Keller, lived in a small house near the eastern edge of the property. Dutch was 35, originally from Pennsylvania, who'd come south seeking opportunities and found work managing enslaved labor. He was neither the cruelest nor the kindest overseer in the county. He did his job with a business-like detachment that some found more unsettling than outright brutality. He carried a whip but used it sparingly, preferring psychological intimidation and the threat of punishment to constant physical violence. But when he did use the whip, he used it effectively, and everyone on the plantation knew it. The winter of 1847 had been particularly harsh. An early frost in October had damaged part of the cotton crop, blackening the bolls before they could be fully harvested. The loss represented a significant financial blow to Hartwell, who'd borrowed heavily to expand his operations the previous year. The debt weighed on him, made him irritable and demanding, and he responded to the crop loss by pushing everyone harder, extending work hours, reducing rations, eliminating the small privileges that had made life marginally more bearable. By December, exhaustion had settled over the cabins like a physical weight. People moved slower, their bodies worn down by months of increased labor and reduced food. Injuries became more common. A hand crushed in the cotton gin, a foot gashed by a mishandled tool, backs strained by loads that were too heavy. Esther did what she could with her herbs and pickuses, but some injuries needed rest to heal, and rest was something no one was allowed. The psychological toll was perhaps even greater than the physical one. There was a sense of hopelessness that had crept into the community, a feeling that things would never get better, that this grinding existence would continue until their bodies gave out. Some of the older workers spoke quietly about people they'd known who'd simply given up, who'd lost the will to keep fighting and had faded away despite having no obvious illness. That kind of death frightened people more than physical violence because it suggested that the spirit could be broken even when the body remained intact. Christmas had always been different at Riverside, though not in a good way. Most plantations in Georgia gave their enslaved workers a few days of rest during the holiday, a brief respite that served as much to maintain productivity as to observe tradition. The logic was simple. People who got occasional breaks worked harder during the rest of the year, and the Christmas holiday provided a safety valve for tensions that might otherwise build to dangerous levels. But James Hartwell had his own ideas about Christmas. He believed idleness bred rebellion, that any break in routine created opportunities for plotting and planning. He'd seen what happened on other plantations where workers were given time off. They gathered, they talked, they remembered that they were human beings with thoughts and desires beyond their labor. Hartwell found this dangerous, so he'd instituted his own tradition. Christmas at Riverside was a working day like any other, with perhaps a slightly larger meal in the evening as the only concession to the holiday. This policy had caused tension with his neighbors, some of whom thought he was being unnecessarily harsh. Even other slaveholders, men who had no moral qualms about the institution itself, thought Hartwell was pushing too hard, creating risks that weren't worth the marginal increase in productivity. But Hartwell dismissed their concerns. He knew his property. He'd say he knew what was necessary to maintain control. On Christmas Eve of 1847, Hartwell made an announcement that would prove to be the final provocation. He assembled everyone in the yard between the cabins and the main house, all 23 enslaved workers, plus Dutch Keller and Margaret, who watched from the porch. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the red clay, and the temperature was dropping rapidly as night approached. Hartwell stood on the porch steps, elevated above the assembled group, and spoke in a voice that carried clearly in the cold air. "Tomorrow," he said, "there would be no rest. Instead, they would begin clearing a new field on the eastern edge of the property, work that would require every able body from dawn until well past dark. The new field was necessary because of the crop loss," he explained. They needed to expand cultivation to make up for the shortfall, and the work needed to begin immediately to have the land ready for spring planting. He went on to detail the expectations. They would clear brush and small trees, remove rocks, begin the process of preparing the soil. It was hard work, the kind that would leave people exhausted and aching, and doing it in December's cold would make it even more difficult. But Hartwell was clear that he expected full effort from everyone, and that any shirking would be dealt with severely. When he finished, he went back inside without waiting for a response. There was never a response expected. The people in the yard stood silently for a moment, processing what they'd just heard, and then slowly dispersed to their cabins as darkness fell and the temperature continued to drop. That night, something shifted in the cabins. It wasn't a sudden change, not a dramatic moment of decision, but rather a gradual coalescing of individual frustrations into a collective understanding. People moved between cabins despite the cold, gathering in small groups, speaking in low voices that wouldn't carry to the main house or to Dutch Keller's residence. Samuel, who rarely spoke about the old days, began telling stories about his mother, about traditions she'd kept alive even in bondage. He talked about resistance, not the violent kind that led to hangings and brutal reprisals, but the quiet kind that preserved dignity and humanity in the face of dehumanization. He spoke about the importance of community, of standing together, of remembering that they were people, not property, regardless of what the law said. Ruth, who usually kept to herself, moved between the cabins with a purpose that others noticed but didn't question. She carried information, things she'd overheard in the main house, details about Hartwell's financial troubles, knowledge about the family's vulnerabilities. She didn't explicitly suggest what should be done with this information, but she made sure people knew it, understood the full picture of their situation. Thomas sat outside his cabin despite the cold, staring at the main house with an expression that made the older workers uneasy. His anger was palpable, barely contained, and there was concern that he might do something rash, something that would bring down violence on the entire community. But when people approached him, tried to talk him down, they found that his anger had crystallized into something colder and more calculated. He wasn't interested in violence, he told them. Violence would accomplish nothing except getting people killed. But there were other ways to resist, other ways to make Hartwell understand what he'd done. Esther moved through the cabins with her medicine bag, tending to injuries and illnesses, but also listening, observing, understanding the mood that was building. She'd seen this before years ago on a different plantation, and she knew it could go in several directions, toward violence, toward despair, or toward something else, something that required courage and coordination, and a willingness to risk everything for a chance at dignity. Benjamin and Clara Ara gathered their children close, speaking to them in whispers about the importance of family, of staying together no matter what happened. The children didn't fully understand what was being discussed, but they sensed the tension, the feeling that something significant was about to occur. Moses, the quiet man from South Carolina, finally spoke about his past. He told about a plantation where he'd seen people push too far, where desperation had led to a violent uprising that had been crushed with overwhelming force. He'd survived that uprising, had the scars to prove it, and he wanted everyone to understand what happened when resistance turned violent. The authorities didn't distinguish between leaders and followers, between those who'd fought and those who'd simply been present. Everyone suffered. Everyone paid the price. If they were going to resist, he said, it had to be smart. Had to be something that couldn't be easily crushed with guns and dogs and the full weight of the law. Jacob, the blacksmith, talked about leverage. He understood power dynamics, understood that Hartwell's control depended on their cooperation, their labor, their willingness to accept their assigned roles. What if they simply stopped cooperating? What if they refused to play their parts in the system? It would be dangerous, certainly, but it might also be effective in ways that violence could never be. The conversations continued through the night, moving from cabin to cabin, involving everyone in the community. There were disagreements, certainly. Some people thought any resistance was too dangerous, that they should simply endure as they'd always endured. Others wanted more dramatic action, wanted to strike back in ways that would hurt Hartwell as much as he'd hurt them. But gradually, through hours of discussion and debate, a consensus emerged. They would resist, but not with violence. They would make a stand, but not one that would give the authorities an excuse to destroy them. They would do something that had never been done before, something that would force Hartwell and everyone else to see them as human beings making a choice, not as property that had malfunctioned. The plan that emerged was simple in concept, but would require extraordinary courage and discipline to execute. On Christmas morning, when the bell rang to summon them to work, they would gather in the yard as usual. But then, instead of proceeding to the new field, they would simply stand there. They wouldn't work. They wouldn't speak. They wouldn't make demands or issue threats. They would just stand silently, refusing to move, refusing to cooperate, forcing Hartwell to confront the reality that his control was an illusion that depended on their consent. It was a plan that could easily fail, that could lead to violence and suffering, but it was also a plan that preserved their dignity, that made a statement about their humanity without giving the authorities an easy excuse for brutal reprisal. If they were going to resist, this was how they would do it. Not as violent rebels, but as human beings asserting their right to be seen and heard. As the night wore on and the temperature dropped further, the 23 made their decision. Each person had to choose individually. No one could be forced or pressured into participating. But one by one they agreed. They would stand together on Christmas morning. They would face whatever consequences came. And they would do it as a community, supporting each other, refusing to let Hartwell break them individually. The temperature dropped as midnight approached. Frost formed on the cabin roofs, glittering in the moonlight like broken glass. Inside the main house, James Hartwell slept in his second-floor bedroom, his wife Margaret in the room beside his, their 2 children in the nursery down the hall. The house was quiet, warm, insulated from the December cold by thick walls and heavy curtains. Hartwell had no idea what was being planned in the cabins behind his house. No sense that the morning would bring something that would change everything. Christmas morning arrived with a pale gray light that turned the frost-covered fields into something almost beautiful. The air was still and cold, so cold that breath came out in thick clouds, and exposed skin stung within seconds. The bell that usually rang at 5 o'clock to wake the workers remained silent, not because of any decision by Hartwell, but because Dutch Keller, who normally rang it, had overslept slightly, thrown off by the holiday. In the cabins, people were already awake. They'd slept little, if at all, and now they prepared themselves for what was coming. They dressed in their warmest clothes, meager as those were. They gathered in small groups, offering each other quiet words of encouragement. Samuel led a prayer, asking for strength and courage, asking that, whatever happened, they would face it together. At 5:30, Dutch Keller finally rang the bell, the sound cutting through the cold morning air. Normally, people would emerge from their cabins quickly, knowing that delays meant punishment. But this morning they emerged slowly, deliberately gathering in the yard between the cabins and the main house. They arranged themselves in a loose semicircle facing the house, and then they simply stood there waiting. Dutch Keller noticed immediately that something was wrong. The usual morning routine, people gathering their tools, organizing into work groups, preparing for the day's labor, wasn't happening. Instead, everyone was just standing there, silent and still, their faces calm, but their eyes alert. Dutch approached them, demanded to know what was going on, why they weren't preparing for work. No one answered. No one even looked at him directly. They just stood there, their silence more unsettling than any words could have been. Dutch went to the main house, climbed the porch steps, and knocked on the door. It took several minutes for anyone to answer. The household was just waking up, and Christmas morning, even at Riverside, usually started slightly later than other days. Finally, Margaret opened the door, still in her nightgown and robe, her hair unpinned. Dutch explained the situation, his voice tight with tension. Margaret's face went pale, and she immediately went upstairs to wake her husband. James Hartwell dressed quickly, descended the stairs, and stepped out onto the front porch. The sight that greeted him would become the subject of countless retellings, each version slightly different, but all agreeing on the essential facts. 23 people stood in the yard between the cabins and the main house. They weren't working, they weren't moving, they were simply standing, arranged in a loose semicircle facing the house. Their hands were empty, their faces were calm, and they were completely, utterly silent. For a moment, Hartwell just stared, trying to process what he was seeing. Then his face flushed red, and he began shouting. He demanded they get to work immediately. He threatened punishments. Whipping reduced rations sailed to the deep south, where conditions were even harsher. His voice echoed across the yard, bouncing off the cabins and fading into the cotton fields beyond. The 23 people didn't move. They didn't speak. They just stood there, watching him with expressions that revealed nothing. Hartwell's first response was anger, the reflexive fury of a man whose authority had been challenged. He shouted orders, demanded explanations, threatened consequences that would make them regret this defiance. He called out individual names, trying to break the collective silence by isolating single voices. "Samuel, you're the oldest here. Tell me what this is about." Silence. "Ruth, you work in my house. You know better than this." Silence. "Thomas, are you behind this? Is this your doing?" Silence. The silence was absolute, unbroken, and it was more unnerving than any shouted defiance would have been. Hartwell was accustomed to resistance that he could understand, people who talked back, who argued, who expressed their anger in ways that justified his punishments. But this silent refusal to engage, this collective withdrawal of cooperation, was something he had no framework for understanding. Margaret Hartwell appeared at the door behind her husband, drawn by his shouting. She took in the scene, the 23 people standing silently in the yard, her husband's red face and clenched fists, the tension that seemed to thicken the cold air, and immediately retreated back inside. She gathered the children and took them upstairs, away from whatever was about to happen. She understood, perhaps before her husband did, that something fundamental had changed, that the normal rules and patterns no longer applied. For 3 hours, the standoff continued. Hartwell alternated between threats and promises, between rage and forced calm. He tried everything he could think of to break the silence. He promised better treatment if they returned to work immediately. He threatened to sell them all, to break up families, to make their lives so miserable they'd beg for mercy. He appealed to individuals he thought might be more susceptible to pressure. He tried reasoning, explaining the economic necessities that required their labor. Nothing worked. The sun rose higher, burning off the frost, and still the 23 stood their ground. Dutch Keller stood on the porch beside Hartwell, his hand resting on the whip at his belt, but he made no move to use it. He understood, perhaps better than Hartwell, that violence at this moment would be a mistake. The group wasn't threatening anyone, wasn't destroying property, wasn't doing anything that clearly justified brutal reprisal. They were simply standing there and attacking them, for that would make Hartwell look like the aggressor, would create sympathy for them that might spread to other plantations. Around 9 o'clock, Hartwell sent Dutch to fetch the sheriff from the county seat. Dutch saddled a horse and rode hard, covering the 12 mi in less than an hour. Sheriff William Crawford was at home with his family preparing for a Christmas meal when Dutch arrived with news of the situation at Riverside. Crawford listened to Dutch's description, asked a few questions, and then gathered 3 deputies and rode back with Dutch to the plantation. Sheriff William Crawford arrived at Riverside shortly after 11 o'clock. He was a man in his early 50s, heavy-set, with gray hair and a face weathered by years of outdoor work. He'd been sheriff for 15 years, had dealt with runaway slaves and minor rebellions before, and he approached the situation with a mixture of caution and confidence. He expected to find something that required force to resolve, armed resistance perhaps, or property destruction that would justify arrests and harsh punishment. What Crawford found instead was something that unsettled him more than outright rebellion would have. The enslaved workers weren't armed, they hadn't destroyed property or threatened violence, they hadn't even spoken. They were simply refusing to work, refusing to acknowledge the authority that had governed their entire lives. It was passive resistance before that term existed, and it terrified the white men who witnessed it because they had no framework for understanding it. Crawford dismounted and approached the group, keeping his voice level and his hand away from his weapon. He was known as a reasonable man by the standards of his time and place, someone who preferred talk to violence when possible. He built his reputation on being able to diffuse tense situations to find solutions that avoided bloodshed while still maintaining the social order. "I'm Sheriff Crawford," he said, addressing the group as a whole since no individual had been identified as a leader. "I need to understand what's happening here. What do you want? What would end this standoff?" The silence that greeted him was absolute. 23 pairs of eyes watched him, but not a single mouth opened to respond. Crawford tried again, using a different approach. "I know Christmas is a hard day to work. Most places give folks time off. Maybe Mr. Hartwell could reconsider. Give you the day to rest and we can all move past this." Still nothing. The silence stretched out, becoming uncomfortable, oppressive. Crawford looked back at Hartwell, who stood on the porch with his arms crossed, his face still flushed with anger. "James, maybe we should talk about this. Maybe there's a compromise here." Hartwell's response was immediate and sharp. "There's no compromise. They work or they face the consequences. I won't be dictated to by my own property." Crawford winced at the phrasing, not out of moral objection, but because he understood that Hartwell's attitude was making the situation worse. The sheriff had dealt with enough tense situations to know that rigid positions led to violence, and violence here would be a disaster. Even if they could force the workers back to their labor, and he wasn't sure they could without killing some of them, the story would spread. Other plantations would hear about it. The enslaved communities throughout the county would learn that resistance was possible, that collective action could challenge the system. That was a precedent Crawford desperately wanted to avoid. By afternoon, word had spread to neighboring plantations. Other owners arrived, some out of curiosity, others out of concern that whatever was happening at Riverside might spread to their own properties. They gathered on Hartwell's porch, discussing options in low voices, while the 23 maintained their vigil in the yard. The plantation owners who arrived represented a cross-section of the county's elite. There was Robert Finch, who owned a large plantation to the north and was known for his relatively lenient treatment of his workers. He gave them Christmas off, allowed them small garden plots, and rarely used physical punishment. There was Thomas Gaines, whose plantation to the south was run with discipline nearly as harsh as Hartwell's. There was William Prescott, an older man who'd inherited his plantation and ran it more out of tradition than passion. And there were several others, each bringing their own perspectives and concerns. The discussion on the porch was heated. Finch argued that Hartwell should simply give them the day off, let them have their Christmas rest, and deal with discipline issues later. "You're creating a situation that doesn't need to exist," he told Hartwell. "Give them what they want today, and tomorrow you can reassert control. But if you push this to violence, you'll regret it." Gaines disagreed. "If we yield to this, we're finished. Every plantation in the county will face the same thing. They'll learn that if they just stand there and refuse to work, we'll cave. We have to make an example here. Show them that this kind of behavior has consequences." Prescott, the older man, offered a different perspective. "I've been doing this for 40 years, and I've never seen anything quite like this. They're not rebelling in the traditional sense. They're not violent. They're just refusing. I don't know what the right response is, but I know that whatever we do here will be remembered. We need to think carefully." The debate continued for hours with no consensus emerging. Some of the owners were genuinely concerned about the precedent this would set. Others were more worried about the practical implications if this spread to their plantations. How would they maintain productivity? How would they keep control? The system they'd built their lives and fortunes on depended on compliance, on the acceptance by enslaved people of their assigned roles. What happened when that acceptance was withdrawn? As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, something remarkable happened. The enslaved workers from 2 neighboring plantations, people who had been given Christmas Day off, began arriving at Riverside. They didn't join the silent protest, but they positioned themselves at the edges of the property, watching. Their presence added a new dimension to the standoff, a suggestion that what was happening here resonated beyond these 23 individuals. The watchers from other plantations didn't speak or interfere. They simply stood at the property boundaries, their presence a silent statement of solidarity or curiosity or both. Their masters noticed immediately and were deeply unsettled. This was exactly what they'd feared. The spread of the idea, the sense that what was happening at Riverside mattered to enslaved people throughout the region. The temperature dropped with the approaching darkness. Margaret Hartwell, watching from an upstairs window, made a decision. She had food and water brought out and placed in the yard within reach of the 23. It was a gesture of basic humanity, an acknowledgement that whatever was happening, these were still people who needed sustenance, but the food and water were refused. The 23 didn't move toward it, didn't acknowledge it. They maintained their positions, their silence, their collective refusal to engage. The sheriff's deputies built a fire near the main house, trying to stay warm. As the night closed in, the plantation owners who'd gathered earlier began to leave, heading back to their own properties, with stories that would grow in the telling. The watchers at the property edges slowly dispersed as darkness fell, though some remained, their presence marked by small fires they built to ward off the cold. And still the 23 stood in the yard, silent and unmoving, their breath visible in the cold air like spirits leaving their bodies. They'd been standing for more than 12 hours now, and the physical toll was evident. Some swayed slightly, fighting exhaustion. Others shifted their weight from foot to foot, trying to maintain circulation in the cold, but no one broke ranks. No one spoke. No one gave Hartwell the satisfaction of seeing them falter. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Riverside intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. What happened next would be the source of the greatest controversy, the detail that would be argued over in courtrooms and newspapers for months to come. Around 7 o'clock, as full darkness settled over the plantation, James Hartwell made a decision. He went into his house, climbed to the second floor, and retrieved a rifle from his study. It was a well-maintained weapon, a hunting rifle he used for deer and other game, and he loaded it with practice efficiency. When he returned to the porch, the rifle in his hands changed the atmosphere immediately. The deputies tensed. The few remaining plantation owners who'd stayed to see how this would resolve exchanged worried glances. Sheriff Crawford stepped forward, his hand raised in a calming gesture. "James, let's think about this. Let's not do anything we'll regret." Hartwell didn't respond to the sheriff. He raised the weapon, pointed it skyward, and fired a single shot into the air. The sound shattered the silence like glass breaking, echoing across the plantation and into the surrounding woods. Birds erupted from trees, the horses in the stable whinnied in alarm, and for a moment, everything froze. The sheriff and his deputies, the remaining plantation owners, the watchers at the property's edges, and then slowly, deliberately, the 23 people in the yard turned and walked back to their cabins. They didn't run. They didn't speak. They simply withdrew, leaving the yard empty, except for the marks their feet had made in the frost-softened ground. They moved as a group, maintaining their collective cohesion even in retreat, and disappeared into their cabins, closing the doors behind them. Hartwell lowered his rifle, his face flushed with what might have been triumph or relief or something more complicated. He declared the situation resolved and invited the other owners inside for drinks. They accepted, though several of them looked troubled, uncertain whether what they just witnessed represented a victory or something else entirely. The sheriff and his deputies remained outside, uneasy about the resolution but unsure what else to do. Crawford approached the cabins, intending to speak with someone to understand what had just happened and whether it was truly over, but when he knocked on doors, no one answered. The cabins were silent, dark, giving no indication of what was happening inside. The watchers from neighboring plantations slowly dispersed, heading back to their own homes with stories that would grow in the telling. By morning, everyone in the county would know that something had happened at Riverside, though the details would vary depending on who was telling the story. Inside the main house, Hartwell poured whiskey for his guests and tried to project confidence. He'd handled the situation. He insisted. He'd shown them who was in control. Tomorrow, things would return to normal, and this whole incident would be forgotten. But even as he spoke, there was a brittleness to his confidence, a sense that he was trying to convince himself as much as his audience. Margaret Hartwell stayed upstairs with the children, unwilling to participate in her husband's celebration. She'd watched the entire day unfold from her window, had seen the silent standoff, had witnessed her husband's increasing desperation, and she understood that something had broken. The system they'd lived under, the assumptions they'd made about control and authority had been challenged in a way that couldn't be easily dismissed or forgotten. In the cabins, the 23 gathered in Samuel's cabin, the largest of the structures. They spoke in whispers, processing what had happened, discussing what would come next. They'd made their stand, had maintained it for more than 12 hours, and had withdrawn on their own terms rather than being forced back to work. It wasn't a complete victory. They'd still have to work tomorrow, would still be enslaved, would still face Hartwell's authority. But they'd proven something important. They could act collectively, could resist in ways that didn't give the authorities easy justification for brutal reprisal, could force the white men who claimed to own them to see them as human beings making choices. But they also understood that there would be consequences. Hartwell wouldn't simply forget what had happened. He would find ways to punish them, to reassert his control, to make sure they understood that their act of resistance had costs. The question was what form those consequences would take, and whether they would be directed at individuals or at the community as a whole. Samuel, speaking in the low, measured tones that commanded respect, reminded everyone of what they'd accomplished. "We stood together," he said. "For 12 hours we stood as one. They couldn't break us. They couldn't make us speak. They couldn't force us back to work. That matters. That will be remembered." Ruth added her own perspective. "I've been in that house for years, and I've never seen Mr. Hartwell like he was today. He was frightened. Underneath all that anger, he was scared because he realized his control isn't absolute. We showed him that." Thomas, the young man whose anger had been a concern, spoke with surprising calm. "My mother was taken from me because Mr. Hartwell needed money. He sold her like she was a piece of furniture. Today we showed him that we're not furniture, we're people, and people can choose not to cooperate." The conversation continued late into the night, with everyone contributing their thoughts and feelings about what had happened. There was pride in what they'd accomplished, but also anxiety about what would come next. They'd crossed a line, had challenged the system in a way that couldn't be undone, and they knew that Hartwell would respond. What they didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that the real resistance was just beginning, and that the Christmas morning standoff would be remembered not as the climax of their story, but as the opening act. The morning after Christmas, the bell rang at 5:00 as usual. The field workers were expected to begin the clearing project that had been postponed. But when Dutch Keller went to the cabins to rouse the workers, he found them empty, not abandoned. Personal belongings remained, the few possessions each person owned still in their places. The blankets were neatly folded. The small carved figures and precious items were arranged carefully on shelves, but the people themselves were gone. All 23 had vanished in the night. Dutch stood in the doorway of Samuel's cabin, staring at the empty space, trying to process what he was seeing. He checked each cabin in turn, finding the same thing in each one. Empty, but not ransacked. Everything was orderly, peaceful, as if the occupants had simply stepped out for a moment and would return shortly. But Dutch knew they weren't coming back. Somehow, impossibly, 23 people had disappeared from a guarded plantation without leaving any trace of their departure. He ran to the main house, pounding on the door with enough force to wake the entire household. James Hartwell appeared at the door in his nightshirt, his hair disheveled, his face still heavy with sleep. "What is it?" he demanded, irritated at being woken so early. "They're gone," Dutch said, his voice tight with tension. "All of them, every single one. The cabins are empty." Hartwell's face went from irritation to confusion to fury in the space of seconds. He pushed past Dutch and ran to the cabins, checking each one himself, as if Dutch might have somehow missed 23 people. But the cabins were indeed empty, and the reality of the situation began to sink in. The discovery sent Hartwell into a fury that his wife would later describe as frightening in its intensity. He immediately organized a search party, pulling together every available man from Riverside and sending word to the surrounding plantations for help. Sheriff Crawford was summoned again, this time bringing a larger force and a pack of tracking dogs. The search began at dawn and continued through the day, covering the woods surrounding the plantation, the banks of the Oconee River, the roads leading to nearby towns. They found nothing. No tracks, no signs of passage, no indication of which direction the group had gone. The tracking dogs were brought to the cabins, given items with the missing workers' scents, and set loose to find a trail. But the dogs circled the cabins wet in confusion and couldn't pick up any trail leading away from the plantation. It was as if 23 people had simply dissolved into the winter air, leaving behind only the mystery of their departure. The search expanded over the following days. Patrols were established on all the major roads. River crossings were watched. Notices were posted in towns throughout Middle Georgia, describing the missing workers and offering substantial rewards for information. Hartwell hired additional men to scour the countryside, convinced that a group that large couldn't simply disappear without leaving some trace. The descriptions in the notices were detailed. Samuel, 56 years old, bent back, graying hair. Ruth, 38, light-skinned, worked in the main house. Thomas, 19, tall and strong. Each of the 23 was described in terms that reduced them to physical characteristics and monetary value, the language of property rather than people. The rewards offered were significant, enough money to tempt anyone who might have information. But weeks passed with no discoveries. The cabins at Riverside remained empty, their doors hanging open, their interiors slowly accumulating dust and dead leaves blown in by winter winds. The plantation's work continued with hired laborers and workers borrowed from neighboring properties, but the absence of the 23 hung over everything like a question that refused to be answered. Theories proliferated throughout the county and beyond. Some believed the group had been helped by abolitionists spirited away on the Underground Railroad that was rumored to have routes through Georgia, though most of those routes ran much further north, and the logistics of moving 23 people at once seemed nearly impossible. Others suggested they'd fled to the swamps of southern Georgia, where fugitives could hide for years in the trackless wetlands, living off the land and avoiding detection. A few whispered darker possibilities that they'd been murdered by someone, their bodies hidden where they'd never be found, though who would have done this and why remained unclear. James Hartwell became obsessed with finding them. He spent enormous sums on the search, hiring professional slave catchers and investigators, following leads that inevitably led nowhere. His behavior grew erratic. Workers on the plantation reported hearing him walking the grounds at night, calling out names, demanding answers from the darkness. He would stand in the empty cabins, staring at the abandoned possessions, trying to understand how this had happened under his watch. His wife grew concerned enough to write to his brother in Savannah, asking for help managing both the plantation and her husband's deteriorating state. The brother came for a visit in late January, spent a week at Riverside, and left deeply troubled by what he'd seen. James had lost weight, wasn't sleeping, and had developed a paranoid edge that made him difficult to be around. He was convinced that someone knew where the 23 had gone, that there was a conspiracy of silence protecting them, and he interrogated anyone who came to the plantation with an intensity that bordered on madness. The financial impact of the disappearance was significant. 23 workers represented a substantial investment, and their loss came at a time when Hartwell was already struggling with debt from the previous year's crop failure. He'd borrowed money to purchase several of the workers, and those debts remained, even though the workers were gone. Insurance didn't cover runaways, and there was no legal recourse that would recover his losses. The plantation's productivity dropped sharply, and Hartwell was forced to borrow more money to hire replacement labor, digging himself deeper into financial trouble. Then, in late February, a discovery was made that would deepen the mystery rather than solve it. A farmer named Josiah Perkins, clearing land about 8 mi from Riverside, found something buried in a shallow depression near a creek. It was a collection of items, 23 small bundles, each carefully wrapped in cloth and tied with string. Perkins, curious, opened one of the bundles and found a carved wooden figure, the kind of thing a child might play with or an adult might keep as a memento. Perkins brought the items to the sheriff, who immediately recognized their potential significance. Crawford brought the bundles to Riverside, where Margaret Hartwell and Dutch Keller examined them. Several were immediately identifiable. There was Samuel's carving, a small figure of a man that he'd worked on for years, adding details and refinements. There was a piece of cloth with careful stitching that Ruth recognized as belonging to her sister. There was a smooth river stone that Thomas had carried since childhood, a gift from his mother before she was sold away. Each bundle contained something personal, something precious, something that would have been treasured by its owner. The discovery raised more questions than it answered. Why would people fleeing for their lives take the time to bury their most precious possessions? What did the burial signify, and how had they managed to do this without being detected? The location where the bundles were found was along a route that search parties had covered multiple times, yet no one had noticed any signs of recent digging or disturbance. A local minister, Reverend Elijah Thorne, was consulted about the discovery. He suggested it might be a ritual of some kind, a symbolic leaving behind of their old lives. Many African traditions, he explained, involved burial of significant objects to mark transitions or transformations. Perhaps the 23 had performed such a ritual before fleeing, marking their departure from slavery and their journey toward freedom. But that explanation satisfied no one. If they were starting new lives elsewhere, why not take these items with them? These were their most precious possessions, the things that connected them to their past, to their families, to their identities. Why bury them in a random location miles from the plantation? And why bury them together in a single cache rather than each person disposing of their own items? Hartwell became fixated on the burial site. He visited it repeatedly, sometimes spending hours there, staring at the ground as if it might yield up its secrets through sheer force of will. He had the area excavated more thoroughly, hoping to find additional clues, but nothing else was discovered. The bundles remained the only physical evidence of where the 23 had gone and what they'd done after leaving Riverside. Spring arrived, bringing its own demands and distractions. The plantation needed to be prepared for planting, and Hartwell was forced to focus on practical matters. Even as his obsession with the missing workers continued to consume him, he hired more workers, both enslaved people purchased from other plantations and free laborers who needed work. But the new workers were uneasy at Riverside, sensing something wrong in the empty cabins and their employers' erratic behavior. In May, there was a potential breakthrough. A traveling merchant passing through the county claimed to have seen a group matching the description of the missing workers in Tennessee working on a farm owned by a Quaker family known for their abolitionist sympathies. Hartwell immediately traveled to Tennessee, bringing Sheriff Crawford and 2 deputies with him. They found the farm, found workers there who'd clearly escaped from slavery, but none of them were from Riverside. The merchant, it turned out, had been mistaken or had been seeking the reward money with false information. The failed trip to Tennessee seemed to break something in Hartwell. He returned to Riverside, more withdrawn, less vocal about his determination to find the missing workers. He continued the plantation's operations, but with a mechanical efficiency that suggested he was going through the motions rather than truly engaging with the work. Margaret noticed the change and was relieved by it, hoping that her husband was finally accepting the loss and moving on. But she also noticed that he still walked the grounds at night, still stood in the empty cabins, still seemed to be waiting for something. Summer passed, then fall. The cotton crop that year was mediocre. Not a disaster, but not profitable enough to significantly reduce Hartwell's debts. He sold off some land to raise cash, reducing the plantation's size for the first time in 3 generations. Neighbors noticed the decline and whispered about it, some with sympathy, others with a satisfaction that came from seeing a proud man brought low. In August, a traveling preacher passing through the area claimed to have information about the missing workers. He said he'd encountered a group matching their description in Alabama, working on a plantation owned by a man who asked no questions about where his workers came from. Hartwell paid the preacher for the information and sent Dutch Keller to investigate. Dutch traveled to Alabama, found the plantation, but once again, none of the workers there were from Riverside. The pattern repeated itself over the following months. Someone would claim to have seen the missing workers. Hartwell would pay for the information or send someone to investigate, and the lead would prove false. Each disappointment took a toll, wearing away at Hartwell's health and sanity. By the winter of 1848, a year after the Christmas morning standoff, he was a shadow of the man he'd been. He'd lost weight. His hair had gone almost completely gray, and he moved with the careful deliberation of someone much older than his 42 years. The years passed. The Civil War came and went, bringing its own upheavals and transformations. Riverside Plantation survived the war, but never fully recovered its antebellum prosperity. The Emancipation Proclamation and the Union victory ended slavery, transforming the entire economic and social system that plantations had been built on. James Hartwell died in 1869 at the age of 63, his obsession with the missing 23 unresolved. His death certificate listed the cause as heart failure, but those who'd known him in his final years understood that he'd been dying slowly for over 20 years, consumed by the mystery he couldn't solve. His wife sold the property and moved to Atlanta, wanting to escape the memories that haunted every corner of the land. The plantation was purchased by a family named Patterson, originally from Pennsylvania, who'd come south after the war, seeking opportunities in the disrupted economy. They hired freedmen to work the land, paying wages instead of owning people, trying to build something new from the ruins of the old system. Among their workers was an elderly man named Samuel, who'd shown up one day in the spring of 1872 asking for employment. He was in his early 80s by then, his back more bent than ever, his hands twisted with arthritis, but he proved himself knowledgeable about cotton cultivation and the specific characteristics of the Riverside soil. The Pattersons hired him, giving him light duties appropriate to his age, and he became a fixture on the plantation, respected by the other workers and valued by his employers. It took 3 years before anyone made the connection. A former neighbor visiting the Pattersons in the summer of 1875 recognized Samuel as one of the missing 23. The revelation sparked immediate interest. Where had he been? What had happened to the others? How had they managed to disappear so completely? Samuel, now in his mid-80s, agreed to tell his story, but only on his own terms. He gathered a small group, the Pattersons, a lawyer from the county seat named Marcus Brennan, and a journalist from Atlanta named Henry Whitfield, who'd heard about the case and traveled to Riverside to investigate. On a cold December evening in 1875, exactly 28 years after the Christmas morning standoff, Samuel finally broke his silence. They met in the main house at Riverside in the same room where James Hartwell had once entertained the plantation owners who'd come to witness the standoff. Samuel sat in a comfortable chair by the fireplace, a blanket over his legs, and began to speak in a voice that was quiet but clear, telling a story that would challenge everything people thought they understood about the disappearance. What Samuel revealed that night would become one of the most remarkable stories of resistance in American history. The 23 hadn't fled to the north. They hadn't been murdered or hidden in the swamps. They'd been at Riverside the entire time. The plantation, Samuel explained, had something most people didn't know about: a network of old storage cellars and tunnels beneath the main house and several of the outbuildings. They'd been built by James Hartwell II during the War of 1812, intended as hiding places for valuables in case of British invasion. The cellars were accessed through concealed entrances in the floors of certain buildings, and they connected to each other through narrow tunnels that had been dug through the red clay soil. Over the decades, the cellars had been largely forgotten. James Hartwell III knew they existed. He'd been shown them as a child. But he rarely thought about them and never used them. New construction and accumulated debris had concealed some of the entrances, and the cellars had become just another forgotten feature of an old plantation. But Samuel had known about them. His mother, who'd worked in the main house during James Hartwell II's time, had shown him the cellars when he was a boy. She'd explained that they were secret places, that knowledge of them should be kept within the enslaved community, passed down carefully from generation to generation. Samuel had kept that knowledge, had shown the cellars to a few trusted people over the years, and had always understood that they might someday be useful. On Christmas night, after Hartwell fired his rifle and everyone retreated to the cabins, the 23 had gathered in the darkness and made their decision. They would disappear, but not by fleeing. They would hide beneath the plantation itself, living in the cellars and tunnels, and they would watch what happened when James Hartwell realized his property had vanished. They'd been preparing for weeks, Samuel explained. Ever since Hartwell had announced there would be no Christmas rest, they'd been gathering supplies and planning. Ruth had stolen food from the main house kitchen in small quantities that wouldn't be noticed. Jacob had quietly set aside tools and materials. Esther had collected herbs and medicines. Benjamin had prepared the cellars, clearing out debris and making them habitable. By Christmas night, everything was ready. The entrances to the cellars were in several locations. One was in the floor of an old storage shed that was rarely used. Another was beneath a loose floorboard in the barn. A third was hidden under a pile of firewood near the blacksmith's forge. The 23 had slipped into the cellars in small groups throughout Christmas night, moving silently through the darkness, and by dawn they were all underground, hidden beneath the very plantation that was searching for them. The journalist Henry Whitfield interrupted at this point, asking the obvious question: why? Why hide beneath the plantation instead of actually fleeing? Why take such an enormous risk when they could have used the same planning and coordination to escape to the north? Samuel's answer was simple and devastating. They'd wanted to see what would happen. They'd wanted to watch James Hartwell destroy himself searching for them. They'd wanted him to understand in the most visceral way possible what it felt like to lose control over people he considered his property. And they'd wanted to prove to themselves that they could resist, that they could exercise agency and make choices even in the most oppressive circumstances. For 3 months, Samuel continued, they'd lived in those tunnels. The conditions were difficult. The cellars were cold, damp, and dark. They had to ration their supplies carefully, making the food and water last as long as possible. They couldn't make noise during the day when people might hear them. They had to manage waste and maintain hygiene in confined spaces. It was uncomfortable, often miserable, but it was also empowering in a way that none of them had experienced before. They'd emerged only at night, moving through the darkness to gather additional food and water, to breathe fresh air, to maintain their strength. The main house had several entrances to the cellars, and they'd use these to access the kitchen and storage areas. They'd watch through concealed openings as Hartwell raged and searched and slowly fell apart. They'd listened to his nighttime wanderings, his shouted demands for answers, and they'd felt something that had been denied to them their entire lives: power. Ruth had been particularly valuable during this time, Samuel explained. Her knowledge of the main house, her understanding of the family's routines, had allowed them to move through the building without being detected. She'd known which floorboards creaked, which doors were kept locked, which rooms were used at which times. She'd guided others through the house at night, showing them how to take what they needed without leaving obvious traces. The buried items, Samuel explained, had been a message, a way of saying they'd left their old lives behind without actually leaving the land. It was symbolic and practical at once, a ritual that marked their transformation from property to people making their own choices. They'd buried the items together in a location that had no particular significance because the act itself was what mattered, not the location. Marcus Brennan, the lawyer, asked about the logistics. How had they coordinated their movements? How had they avoided detection for so long? Samuel smiled, a rare expression that transformed his weathered face, and explained that it had required careful planning and discipline. They'd established rules. No one moved alone. Everyone had a partner who would notice if something went wrong. They'd created schedules for when different people would emerge, ensuring that the cellars were never completely empty in case someone needed to hide quickly. They'd developed signals, patterns of knocks and taps that allowed them to communicate through the floors and walls. The most dangerous moments, Samuel said, had come when search parties had walked directly over their hiding places. They'd heard the footsteps above, the voices of men searching for them, and they'd had to remain absolutely silent, barely breathing, terrified that some sound would give them away. But the searchers had never thought to look beneath the buildings, had never imagined that the missing workers might be hiding right under their feet. In late March, when the search had finally died down, and Hartwell's attention had turned to other matters, the 23 had begun leaving in small groups, 2 or 3 at a time, spacing their departures over several weeks. They'd slipped away from Riverside and made their way to various destinations. Some had gone north, using the underground railroad routes that did exist, though they were dangerous and uncertain. Some had gone to cities where they could disappear into free black communities, taking new names and building new lives. Some, like Samuel, had eventually returned to Georgia, waiting until enough time had passed that they could live openly without fear of being connected to the disappearance. Henry Whitfield asked about the others. Where were they now? Were they still alive? Samuel's expression became guarded. He wouldn't reveal that information, he said. Some secrets needed to be kept. Some people deserved to live their lives without being defined by what they'd done on one Christmas morning in 1847. He'd agreed to tell his own story because he was old, because the people who might have punished him were dead, and because he wanted the truth to be known, but he wouldn't betray the others, wouldn't expose them to potential consequences even decades after the fact. The story Samuel told that night was published in the Atlanta Constitution in January of 1876. It caused a sensation, not just in Georgia, but throughout the South and North. Some people called it a hoax, insisting that Samuel was lying or confused, that the story was too incredible to be true. Others saw it as a powerful symbol of resistance, a demonstration that enslaved people had found ways to fight back, that went beyond the violent rebellions that had terrified white Southerners for generations. Investigators were sent to Riverside to verify Samuel's claims about the tunnels. They found them exactly as he'd described, a network of underground spaces beneath the main house and outbuildings with concealed entrances that had been carefully maintained despite their supposed abandonment. Evidence of recent habitation was found. Makeshift beds made from old blankets, empty food containers, even a few personal items that matched descriptions of belongings owned by the missing 23. The physical evidence confirmed Samuel's story, silencing most of the skeptics. The discovery of the tunnels and the confirmation of Samuel's account forced a reevaluation of what had happened at Riverside. This wasn't just a story of people fleeing slavery. It was a story of psychological warfare, of enslaved people using their knowledge and intelligence to torment their oppressor in ways that were more effective than violence could have been. They turned Hartwell's own property against him, had hidden in the very foundations of his power, and had watched as he destroyed himself trying to find them. James Hartwell's widow, Margaret, was interviewed by Henry Whitfield in the spring of 1876. She was living in Atlanta by then, remarried to a banker named Charles Drummond, trying to build a life separate from her plantation past. When asked about Samuel's revelation, she was quiet for a long moment before responding. She said she'd always suspected something like this, though she'd never been able to articulate exactly what. The way the search had found nothing, the way her husband had seemed to sense their presence without ever locating them. It had felt wrong, she said, like they were being watched by invisible eyes. She'd mentioned this to James several times, but he dismissed her concerns as female hysteria, insisting that the workers had fled and would eventually be found. She also revealed something she'd never told anyone. On several occasions during those 3 months, she'd found small things moved in the main house. A book placed differently on a shelf, a curtain tied back that she was certain had been closed, food missing from the kitchen in quantities too small to be noticed unless you were paying close attention. At the time, she'd attributed it to her own distraction, or to servants being careless. Now she understood that the 23 had been moving through the house at night, taking what they needed, leaving traces of their presence that only someone looking for them would notice. Margaret also spoke about her husband's decline. The obsession with finding the missing workers had consumed him, she said, had taken over his life in ways that destroyed his health and his relationships. He'd become paranoid, suspicious of everyone, convinced that people were lying to him or hiding information. He'd spent enormous sums on the search, had neglected the plantation's operations, had driven away friends and family with his erratic behavior. By the time he died, he was isolated and broken. A man who'd been defeated not by violence, but by his own inability to accept that his control had been an illusion. The revelation of what happened at Riverside had ripple effects throughout Georgia and beyond. It became a story told in different communities with different emphasis. In Black communities, it was a tale of clever resistance, of people using their knowledge and patience to strike back at their oppressors in a way that caused no physical violence, but inflicted deep psychological wounds. In white communities, it was often told as a cautionary tale about the dangers of being too harsh, of pushing people to the point where they'd risk everything for even a small measure of control over their own lives. Historians and scholars would later debate the broader significance of the Riverside incident. Some saw it as an isolated event unique to the specific circumstances of that plantation and those 23 individuals. Others argued it represented a form of resistance that was probably more common than historical records suggested. Quiet strategic actions that left few traces but had profound effects on the people involved. Samuel lived another 9 years after revealing his story, working at Riverside until his death in 1884. At the age of 93, he was buried in a small cemetery near the plantation. His grave marked with a simple stone that bore his name, his dates, and a single line. He stood his ground. At his funeral, attended by both Black and white members of the community, several people spoke about his courage, not just in participating in the Christmas morning standoff and the months of hiding that followed, but in choosing to return to the place where it had happened and live out his final years on land that held so many painful memories. In the decades that followed, Riverside Plantation changed hands several times. The tunnels beneath the buildings were eventually sealed in the 1890s, deemed unsafe and unnecessary. The main house was renovated, modernized, stripped of many of its original features. By the early 20th century, few visible traces remained of what had happened there in 1847 and 1848. But the story persisted. It was passed down through families, both Black and white, each generation adding their own interpretations and emphasis. Some versions focused on the cleverness of the plan, the way the 23 had used their knowledge of the plantation to hide in plain sight. Others emphasized the psychological warfare aspect, the way they'd used Hartwell's own obsession against him, watching as he destroyed himself, searching for them. Still others saw it as a spiritual story, a demonstration of faith and community that transcended the physical circumstances of bondage. In 1947, on the 100th anniversary of the Christmas morning standoff, a small ceremony was held at Riverside. Descendants of both the enslaved workers and the Hartwell family attended, a gathering that would have been impossible just decades earlier. A marker was placed near the site of the old cabins commemorating the 23 and their act of resistance. The inscription was simple. They stood their ground and found their freedom. December 25, 1847. The marker still stands today, though the plantation itself has been subdivided and developed. Houses now occupy the land where cotton once grew. The main house, renovated and expanded multiple times, serves as a private residence. The tunnels beneath it remain sealed, their entrances hidden behind modern foundations and landscaping. But people still visit the marker, still tell the story, still debate what it means and what lessons it holds. What the 23 did on that Christmas morning in 1847 was shocking, not because it was violent or destructive, but because it was something far more subversive. It was a demonstration that enslaved people could exercise agency, could make choices, could resist in ways that didn't fit the narratives of either docile submission or violent rebellion that dominated discussions of slavery. They didn't attack their master, they didn't destroy his property, they simply refused to work, refused to speak, and then disappeared in a way that tormented him far more effectively than any physical assault could have. The psychological impact on James Hartwell was profound and lasting. According to family letters preserved in the Georgia Historical Society, he never fully recovered from the experience. He became paranoid, suspicious of everyone around him, convinced that other workers on the plantation knew more than they were saying. His health deteriorated. His business judgment suffered. The plantation that had been profitable under his father and grandfather struggled under his increasingly erratic management. He died relatively young at 63, worn down by years of obsession and frustration. But perhaps the most significant impact was on the other enslaved people in the region. Word of what happened at Riverside spread quickly, carried by the informal networks that connected enslaved communities across the South. The story was told and retold, adapted and embellished, but always carrying the same core message. Resistance was possible even in the most oppressive circumstances. You didn't have to accept your condition as inevitable. You could find ways to fight back that used intelligence and patience instead of violence. There's no way to know how many other acts of resistance were inspired by the Riverside incident. The nature of such resistance, quiet, strategic, often invisible to those in power, means it rarely left historical records. But scholars who study slavery have found hints and suggestions in plantation records, in letters, in court documents, unexplained disappearances, work slowdowns with no clear cause, masters complaining about a sense of unease among their workers, a feeling that something was happening beneath the surface that they couldn't quite identify. The story of Riverside also challenges common assumptions about what resistance looked like under slavery. Popular imagination often focuses on dramatic rebellions like Nat Turner's or escapes to the North via the Underground Railroad. These were real and important, but they were also rare and extremely dangerous. The vast majority of enslaved people never had the opportunity to participate in such dramatic acts. What they could do was find smaller ways to resist, to maintain their humanity and dignity in a system designed to strip both away. The Christmas morning standoff and the months of hiding that followed represented one such act. A carefully planned demonstration that required coordination, courage, and an understanding of psychology that would have impressed trained strategists. The decision to hide beneath the plantation rather than flee was brilliant in its simplicity. It allowed them to maintain their resistance for months rather than days, to watch the effects of their actions, to feel a sense of control that had been denied to them their entire lives. Samuel's decision to eventually reveal the truth was also significant. By 1875, when he told his story, the Civil War had ended slavery, and Reconstruction had attempted to reshape Southern society. The political and social landscape had changed enough that he could speak without fear of being returned to bondage. But his revelation served another purpose. It ensured that what the 23 had done wouldn't be forgotten, wouldn't be reduced to just another mysterious disappearance in the historical record. The journalist who interviewed Samuel and published his story noted that the old man seemed at peace with his past. He'd lived through slavery, had participated in an extraordinary act of resistance, had survived to see freedom, and had chosen to return to the place where his resistance had occurred. When asked if he had any regrets, Samuel reportedly said no. Every moment in those tunnels, every night of cold and discomfort, every risk they'd taken, it had all been worth it to see James Hartwell's face that Christmas morning. To watch him realize that his control was an illusion, that the people he thought he owned had wills and minds and courage he'd never imagined. This mystery shows us that the most powerful acts of resistance aren't always the loudest or most violent. Sometimes they're the quiet demonstrations of will that force those in power to confront the humanity they've tried to deny. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed? Or do you think there are still secrets buried at Riverside? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more historical mysteries like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves stories that make you question what really happened. See you in the next video. The legacy of that Christmas morning in 1847 extends far beyond the immediate participants and their descendants. It became part of the larger narrative of resistance to slavery, a narrative that historians are still working to fully document and understand. For too long, the story of slavery was told primarily from the perspective of those who held power: plantation owners, politicians, The architects of the system, of the voices of the enslaved, were largely absent, their stories lost or deliberately suppressed. But stories like Riverside remind us that those voices existed, that resistance was constant and creative, that enslaved people never accepted their condition as natural or inevitable. They fought back in ways large and small, using whatever tools and opportunities were available to them. Sometimes that meant running away, sometimes it meant breaking tools or working slowly, sometimes it meant preserving cultural traditions and family bonds despite systematic efforts to destroy them, and sometimes, as on that Christmas morning in 1847, it meant standing silently in a yard, refusing to move, refusing to speak, refusing to be anything other than human beings, making a choice. The 23 people who stood in that yard are mostly forgotten now. We know some of their names: Samuel, Ruth, Thomas, Esther, Benjamin, Clara, Moses, Jacob, but many others have been lost to history. We don't know what happened to most of them after they left Riverside. We don't know if they found the freedom they were seeking, if they built good lives for themselves and their families, if they ever spoke about what they'd done on that Christmas morning and in the months that followed. But we know they existed. We know they made a choice that shocked Georgia and rippled out across the South. We know they demonstrated courage and intelligence in a refusal to accept the roles that had been forced upon them. And we know that their story, once revealed, became part of the larger story of how enslaved people resisted, survived, and ultimately helped bring down the system that had held them in bondage. The marker at Riverside stands as a testament to their courage. But the real memorial is the story itself, passed down through generations, told and retold, each telling, adding new layers of meaning and interpretation. It's a story that reminds us that history is more complex than we often acknowledge. That the people we've been taught to see as powerless often found ways to exercise power. And that the most shocking acts are sometimes the ones that use patience and intelligence instead of violence. What 23 enslaved people did on Christmas morning in 1847 shocked Georgia because it revealed a truth that those in power didn't want to acknowledge. That enslaved people were thinking, planning, strategizing human beings who could outsmart their masters and resist their oppression in ways that were both subtle and devastating. They didn't need weapons or violence. They just needed courage, coordination, and a deep understanding of the psychology of those who claimed to own them. And in the end, they won. Not in the sense of overthrowing the system that would take a war and decades of struggle, but in the sense that they proved to themselves and to others that resistance was possible, that they had agency, that they were more than the property their masters claimed them to be. They stood their ground on Christmas morning, disappeared into the tunnels beneath their oppressors' feet, and in doing so, they found a freedom that went beyond physical escape. They found the freedom that comes from making your own choices, from refusing to accept someone else's definition of who and what you are, from demonstrating that the human spirit cannot be owned no matter what the law says. That's what shocked Georgia, not violence or destruction, but the quiet demonstration that enslaved people were human beings with wills of their own, capable of resistance that was strategic, patient, and ultimately more powerful than any rebellion could have been. The 23 showed that you didn't have to accept your oppression, that you could find ways to fight back even in the most impossible circumstances, and that sometimes the most effective resistance is the kind that makes your oppressor question everything they thought they knew about power and control. Their story deserves to be remembered, not just as a historical curiosity, but as a testament to human resilience and the unbreakable will to be free. It deserves to be told and retold, studied and honored because it represents something fundamental about the human experience. That people will always find ways to resist dehumanization. That dignity cannot be stripped away no matter how oppressive the system. And that the most powerful acts of defiance are often the ones that use intelligence and patience rather than force. The tunnels beneath Riverside have been sealed for over a century now, but they remain a powerful symbol of what happened there. They represent the hidden spaces where resistance was planned and executed, the literal underground from which 23 people challenged the system that claimed to own them. They remind us that history has layers, that what we see on the surface often conceals deeper truths, and that the most important stories are sometimes the ones that take decades or centuries to fully emerge. Samuel's decision to tell his story in 1875 was an act of courage in its own right. He was an old man by then, with little to lose, but he still took a risk by revealing what had happened. He could have taken the secret to his grave, could have let the mystery remain unsolved, could have protected himself and the others by maintaining the silence that had served them so well. But he chose to speak to ensure that the truth was known, to make sure that what the 23 had done would be remembered and understood. His story, published in the Atlanta Constitution and reprinted in newspapers across the country, sparked conversations about slavery, resistance, and the nature of power that continued for years. It challenged assumptions, forced people to reconsider what they thought they knew, and added a new dimension to the ongoing debates about race, freedom, and justice that were reshaping American society in the aftermath of the Civil War. The story of Riverside also had personal impacts on the people who heard it. For descendants of enslaved people, it was a source of pride and inspiration, a demonstration that their ancestors had been resourceful and courageous, that they'd found ways to resist even in the most oppressive circumstances. For descendants of slaveholders, it was often uncomfortable, forcing them to confront the reality that the system their ancestors had built and defended was more fragile and contested than they'd been taught. The physical landscape of Riverside has changed dramatically since 1847. The cotton fields have been replaced by houses and roads. The main house has been renovated so many times that little of the original structure remains visible. The cabins where the 23 lived are long gone, their locations marked only by slight depressions in the ground and the occasional artifact turned up by construction or gardening. But the story remains embedded in the land itself, a reminder of what happened there and what it meant. Visitors to the marker today often report feeling a sense of presence, a connection to the past that goes beyond intellectual understanding. Whether this is genuine spiritual experience or simply the power of knowing the story is debatable, but it speaks to the enduring impact of what the 23 did. Their act of resistance continues to resonate, continues to inspire, continues to challenge us to think about power, freedom, and the human capacity for courage in the face of overwhelming oppression. The question that Samuel refused to answer, what happened to the other 22, remains one of the enduring mysteries of the story. Did they all survive? Did they find freedom and build new lives? Did some of them die in the attempt, their stories lost to history? We'll probably never know the full truth, and perhaps that's appropriate. Some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved, some secrets are meant to be kept. And the privacy of those 22 individuals deserves to be respected even across the gulf of centuries. What we do know is that their act of resistance mattered. It mattered to them, giving them a sense of agency and dignity that had been systematically denied. It mattered to James Hartwell, destroying his peace of mind and contributing to his early death. It mattered to other enslaved people who heard the story and drew inspiration from it. And it matters to us today as we continue to grapple with the legacy of slavery and the ongoing struggle for justice and equality. The story of what 23 enslaved people did on Christmas morning in 1847 is ultimately a story about the power of collective action, the importance of strategic thinking, and the indomitable nature of the human spirit. It's a story that deserves to be remembered, studied, and honored as part of the larger narrative of American history. It's a story that challenges us to look beyond simple narratives of oppression and resistance to understand the complexity and creativity of how people fought back against dehumanization. And it's a story that reminds us that the most shocking acts are sometimes the ones that use silence instead of shouting, patience instead of violence, intelligence instead of force. The 23 stood their ground, disappeared into the darkness beneath their oppressors' feet. And in doing so, they wrote themselves into history in a way that violence never could have achieved. They shocked Georgia not through destruction, but through demonstration. Demonstration that they were human beings with agency, intelligence, and an unbreakable will to be free. That's the legacy of Riverside Plantation. That's what happened on Christmas morning in 1847. And that's why nearly 2 centuries later, we're still telling their story. 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 Still telling